Good evening. Tonight we start with something small and deceptively simple. A single leaf, the modest gift of the tobacco plant, destined to cross oceans and help build an empire of dependence. Forget the slick cigarette commercials and the dreamy haze of jazz club nostalgia. The actual story of tobacco is harsher, anchored in fields, loading docks, and hospital wards. The reality is, if you were born in a place ruled by tobacco, you would not escape untouched. To live honestly under its dominion meant long days, rising debts, and entanglements that could cling to families for generations. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive, take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your location and local time in the comments as well. I'm always amazed by how far this community reaches. Silence your notifications, take a slow breath, and let's begin. Long before a European hull sliced its first wake across the Atlantic, tobacco existed as a varied clan of plants, quietly shaped and reshaped by human hands and mouths across two continents. In the cool dirt of river valleys and on the terraced slopes of the Andes, in sandy clearings beside Caribbean lagoons, and in the rich loam of the eastern woodlands, many species of Nicotiana were coaxed, carried, and remade by people for reasons that went far beyond the sweet commerce the plant would later sustain. Tobacco's story does not begin as a fluke of trade. It begins as a chain of domestic intimacies, seeds kept from strong plants, seedlings shaded and guarded, leaves tested for their burn and aroma, and smoke watched as if it were prayer. Archaeology has been patient in recovering this history. Pottery from Mesoamerica and the Andes, when subjected to chemical testing, has yielded traces of nicotine and related alkaloids, pushing the human use of tobacco deep into the pre-Columbian past. Clay pipes and carved effigies show lips ready to send smoke outward. Glyphs and painted scenes in Maya codices and mural fragments let us watch smoke curl like a ladder between human beings and the divine. Those faint chemical residues and those enduring images tell us tobacco was no casual snack or minor seasoning. It was a medium, a volatile, portable, fragrant channel through which petitions, bargains, and protections were conveyed to ancestors, spirits, and unseen powers. Across the sprawling mosaic of indigenous cultures, the plant took on specific forms and meanings. The Arawak and Taino peoples of the Caribbean rolled leaves into tubes and inhaled the smoke, a practice that astonished sailors of the late 15th century. In the great river societies of the Amazon and Orinoco, powdered tobacco snuffs, sometimes mixed with ashes and other botanical medicines, were given by shamans for diagnosis, protection, or journeys of vision. These were tools of healing, not simple intoxicants. Among the peoples of the eastern woodlands of North America, tobacco was tightly woven into social and ceremonial life. It was tended in household gardens, measured out in small ritual bundles, offered as a sign of respect when visiting, used to seal marriages, and placed upon altars during rites of condolence. The Haudenosaunee, for example, regarded tobacco as a necessary gift in condolence and opening ceremonies that structured political life. Tobacco meant diplomacy and commitment. It carried speech. Growing practices reflected these meanings. In its earliest human settings, tobacco was rarely sown as a vast cleared monocrop. Instead, it lived in household plots and tucked away garden spaces. Seedbeds were meticulously cared for, young plants hardened off, and leaves hand-harvested at carefully chosen moments of ripeness. Different communities preferred different species and selected for particular traits. Some valued thin, intense leaves that flared up hot and bright. Others treasured broad, oily leaves that burned slowly or could be crushed into snuff. The ancestors of what would become the commercially dominant Nicotiana tabacum seem to have been fashioned in coastal and Andean horticultural networks, while Nicotiana rustica and various local wild types became domestic and semi-domestic varieties across much of North America. Human hands preserved knowledge about shade, about enriching soil with ash or animal manure, about when to harvest, and about the quiet, tedious craft of drying and curing leaves so they would keep and burn as intended. There was real skill in curing. Leaves were hung in rafters, slowly smoked in special structures, or spread on racks under the sun so that when the leaf finally needed to be burned in a bowl or rolled into a tube, it behaved exactly as the ritual demanded. And there were plenty of rituals. On the Great Plains and in the upper Mississippi Valley, the pipe became a social instrument: clay, stone, or wooden stem, its bowl carved with markers of lineage, its smoke an accepted currency in speeches. French traders who arrived in the 17th century called those long ceremonial pipes calumets, but that was their label for something that already had indigenous names and histories. For the Lakota, the sacred pipe, the Changnungpa, bound the world together. Its smoke made treaties legible to the ancestors. In the Southwest and among Pueblo peoples, tobacco joined corn and beans in a sacred agricultural triad, a plant of reciprocity and balance. In Mesoamerica, Aztec and Mixtec ritualists paired tobacco with copal and cacao. It appeared in funerary offerings and in the tools of priests and healers across the Amazon. Fine tobacco powder could be blown into the nostrils as a cleansing, a substance that hurt in order to heal, that sharpened perception and cleared spiritual or bodily disorders. Whether smoked, chewed, drunk as a potion, or taken as snuff, tobacco was diffused into the body of social life. It functioned as medicine, as a tool of law and agreement, as an object of exchange, and as a conduit to the sacred. Language preserves this embedding. Tobacco was woven into speech as firmly as it was into soil. The word that European tongues would borrow, tobacco, tabac, began in the islands and moved with the wind. Indigenous vocabularies contained rich clusters of terms, many of them tied to specific varieties and practices. In the northern forests, Algonquian-speaking peoples had names for smoking mixtures and the devices that carried them. Europeans later borrowed kinnikinnick to label indigenous smoking blends. In the Caribbean, the Taíno word that Spaniards wrote down as tobacco would become tabac in French and tabaco in Spanish, carrying with it a cargo of social meanings into other languages. These were not mere plant labels. They pointed to practice, to portable rituals that the Atlantic world would soon intercept and attempt to reshape. For indigenous communities, tobacco's uses and logics were rooted in obligations. It was a plant of offering and return. It bound relatives to ancestors, leaders to their people, and humans to the powers that governed hunting, fertility, and the weather. Those obligations explain why, even when leaves were traded, taken, or sold, they so often returned in ceremonial form, as offerings, as vow payments, as tokens of relationship. That sacred infrastructure would be strained and ultimately ruptured when the same plant was turned into a commodity in imperial markets. When European sailors anchored in the Caribbean in 1492, they first saw the outward habit: men wrapping leaves and sending plumes of smoke into the air, women stowing cured leaves in bundles, the sharp smell of burned green. Columbus and his crew wrote of men holding pipes or rolled leaves, of smoke rising from the villages they visited on Hispaniola and Cuba. That small, fragrant observation was a hinge. Within a single generation, knowledge of tobacco, its forms, its names, its uses, had crossed the Atlantic aboard Spanish caravels, Portuguese caravels, and French ships. Sailors took to the plant easily. It was a portable stimulant for cramped, often lonely life at sea. Soldiers found it soothing for their nerves. Merchants saw a potential income stream. And physicians, the credentialed curious of Europe, who compiled treatises on every new arrival from the Indies, began to write about tobacco as though it might be a cure-all. Spanish chroniclers, like Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, wrote early and at length about Caribbean and mainland customs, and tobacco appears again and again in his accounts of native life. Bartolomé de las Casas, who spent decades among indigenous peoples in Cuba and Hispaniola, described smoking and chewing as widespread practices with social significance. Those accounts traveled back across the Atlantic in trunks, manuscripts, and printed books. Through the 16th century, the plant sat uneasily between oddity and remedy. Nicolás Monardes, a Spanish physician in Seville, published in 1565 his now famous Historia Medicinal de las Cosas que se traen de nuestras Indias Occidentales, in which he promoted several New World plants, including tobacco as treatments, for a startling catalogue of European ailments. The list reads like wish fulfillment. Toothache, headache, and even plague were said to yield to tobacco. In Europe, tobacco first occupied a double status: exotic and medicinal. Around diplomatic tables, it soon adopted another role. In the 1560s, the French ambassador Jean Nicot, whose name Europe would later attach to the plant's signature alkaloid-scent tobacco seeds and powdered leaf, to Catherine de' Medici. The story that her headaches were relieved by the new plant spread through courtly circles. Nicot's name stuck. Linnaeus would later christen the genus Nicotiana in his honor, and in the 19th century, the alkaloid nicotine would take the ambassador's name as well. In the British Isles, figures like Sir Walter Raleigh became linked with the spectacle of smoking at court in the later 16th century. His name, like Nicot's, became shorthand for an imported habit. Meanwhile, the Portuguese carried tobacco to Africa and Asia. Through their long-distance routes in the 16th century, the plant reached Japan and China, sparking new local forms. The kisaru pipe in Japan, slow and ceremonious water pipes in parts of the Islamic world, nasal snuffs in portions of Europe. Sailors and merchants transmitted not only plants, but practices. Tobacco proved fully mobile. Its reception was far from uniform. In the early 17th century, King James I of England, mistranslated here as James III, issued his 1604 counterblast to tobacco, one of the first state-level moral condemnations of the plant. He denounced smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and he saw in its foreign origin an insult to English propriety. Yet royal edicts and scoldings could not check its allure. By the 17th century, snuffing and smoking were fashionable in elite salons. Snuff, in particular, became a peak vehicle of aristocratic display packed into ornate boxes, some covered in enamel and jewels. In England and the Dutch Republic, the pipe grew into a familiar symbol of sociability. From coffeehouse benches to ship decks, tobacco moved from medicine to fashion and increasingly to everyday habit. The slow turn from curiosity to hard currency solidified in the early 17th century in the soil of colonization. Jamestown, the English outpost founded in 1607 along the James River, tottered for years between the arrival of supply ships and the threat of starvation. Men died in large numbers, women were few. Yet in Virginia's soil, a particular strain of tobacco showed promise. John Rolfe, an English settler who began experimenting with the plant in 1612, is often credited with refining a sweeter, more agreeable form of Nicotiana tabacum from seeds that likely reached him via Bermuda in the West Indies. By 1614, when Rolfe married Pocahontas, a union loaded with symbolic reconciliation, Virginia tobacco was already finding customers in England. The leaf that Rolfe and other colonists raised tasted different from coarser native varieties. It was milder and broader leafed. Tailored to European palates, and it sold. The impact on colonial economics was immediate and structural. Tobacco became not just a good to be stuffed into a ship's hold, but a currency that structured social and fiscal life. The Virginia Company, and later the colonial assemblies, built land grants and labor incentives around tobacco. The headright system, first formalized in 1618, promised roughly 50 acres of land for every new settler whose passage was financed to Virginia. The plan was straightforward: bring people, plant fields, export leaf. Tobacco receipts and notes circulated. Planters shipped casks called hogsheads heavy, fragrant barrels whose contents, measured in pounds, were pledged to London merchants. Credit advanced against future cargo bound the planter to his factor in port. Tobacco literally bankrolled the colonial project. This economic shift rewrote large stretches of social organization. Tobacco required land and labor in bulk. Where indigenous horticulture had relied on rotations and modest plots, colonial tobacco cultivation pushed toward constant expansion and a logic of exhaustion. The plant is, in its way, ravenous for topsoil. It drains nutrients and demands fresh ground. The pattern became familiar. Planters cleared forest, shifted their seedbeds, opened new fields. That continuous push displaced indigenous communities and fueled recurring conflict. The 1622 uprising, led by Opechancanough, a Powhatan Confederacy leader, was in part a reaction to relentless English expansion and the seizure of lands deeply tied to indigenous lifeways. The assault of 1622 killed hundreds of colonists and triggered English military retaliation, that permanently altered the balance of power in the Chesapeake. Later cycles of attack and counterattack would shape a long era of dispossession and violence, each episode folding back into the same basic demand: more land for more tobacco. Labor systems shifted as well. Early tobacco fields depended heavily on indentured servants, English and Irish men and women who signed contracts to work a set term in exchange for passage and the hope of land or wages after service. But the financial logic of tobacco pushed planters toward a new calculation. Indentured labor produced a rotating, sometimes unruly workforce whose eventual land ownership could fuel social unrest. Colonists faced chronic labor shortages, and the transatlantic slave trade offered colonial elites a more permanent answer. The first recorded Africans sold in Virginia arrived in 1619 at Point Comfort. Their status was initially ambiguous, somewhere between indentured and enslaved. But by the mid-17th century, legal and social structures were hardening into race-based chattel slavery. Bacon's rebellion in 1676, a violent coalition of landless freemen, servants, and enslaved people against elite planters, terrified the ruling class. In response, they sought a labor system that would firmly separate poor Europeans from enslaved Africans in law and custom. The result was a systematic turn toward perpetual bondage, binding tobacco wealth to human captivity. The commodity logic brought volatility alongside profit. Tobacco markets were stubbornly unstable. In fertile seasons, planters flooded the market with more leaf than buyers could absorb. In bad years, crops failed and debts piled up. London merchants and colonial planters found themselves in a continual dance of supply and credit. Merchants advanced cloth, tools, and goods, extending credit against the next season's harvest. When prices fell, planters defaulted. Their land was mortgaged, and some lost everything. The Virginia House of Burgesses and other colonial bodies repeatedly tried to steady the trade with legislation quality standards, rules on hogshead size and markings, shipment controls. But the Atlantic market had its own pulse. Tobacco's success itself bred crises of oversupply. Imperial governments saw the crop as a ready revenue source and moved to control it. Tariffs, monopolies, and excise taxes became instruments for crowns hungry for predictable income. Logistics were at once monumental and intimate. Tobacco traveled in hogsheads, heavy wooden barrels packed in cool cellars and counted as units of wealth. Shipping lanes tied Chesapeake and Caribbean plantations to Bristol, London, Amsterdam, and later Glasgow. Colonial warehouses rose like dense knots of timber and paper. Factors in port towns kept ledgers thick with the names of planters, tracking advances and consignments. The Atlantic became the main artery through which tobacco moved, and alongside it grew fleets, insurers, and specialists in handling leaf and ledger alike. Smuggling, piracy, and the human toll of seafaring were woven into that circulation. Around tobacco, social classes sharpened. In the Chesapeake, a planter elite consolidated land and authority. They built great houses, served on colonial councils, and measured their wealth in acres, hogsheads, and the number of hands they commanded in the fields. Small freeholders and indentured servants might aspire to that status, but few crossed the divide. In the Caribbean, sugar would later outstrip tobacco and reward an even more brutal planter consolidation. But in the 17th century, tobacco had already pushed the first English colonies into an export-driven quasi-aristocracy. Legal codes, courts, and assemblies gradually bent towards safeguarding property land, crops, and labor. Protection took many forms. Colonial governments tried to limit planting during gluts, standardize containers, regulate exports, and in some cases levy excise duties. Metropoles watched for tax revenue. England's Navigation Acts of 1651 and later iterations required that colonial products, tobacco among them, flow through English ships and ports to be taxed and re-exported. Crown and merchant capital traded privilege and protection. London's tobacco merchants assumed serious risk in financing shipments and storage. Their fortunes rose and fell with colonial harvests. Merchant houses became a new power center, shaping colonial policy by controlling credit and choosing who survived and who was foreclosed from the trade. Environmental consequences crept in slowly but decisively. Tobacco's hunger-stripped fields. Monoculture drained soils and drove settler colonists into repeated land seizures. Forest mosaics that had supported complex indigenous hunting and farming were cleared in long, ragged strips. That clearing heightened conflict not only with native peoples, but also with climate and disease. Single-crop fields are more vulnerable to pests and blight. When tobacco displaced food crops, colonies grew more dependent on imported staples. Food security shrank, even as export capacity swelled. That paradox, the hungry colony sending away mountains of leaf for distant profit, became a recurring feature of colonial life. Even as tobacco enriched a narrow class of planters and a band of merchants, its cultural imprint spread everywhere. In England, Wales, the Low Countries, and France, pipes and snuff blurred social lines. They were at once tools of aristocratic display and cheap indulgences of the poor. In port towns, sailors traded not only in leaf, but in stories. In salons and shops, Europeans reinterpreted the plant to suit their own anxieties and tastes. The same leaf that sealed a treaty in a native council house might sit on a Parisian dressing table as powder inside a gilded box. That double existence, sacred and secular only, deepened tobacco's grip on the Atlantic world. Economically, the plant was layered in paradox. A species nurtured for millennia within indigenous cultures, as a ritual medium became in colonial hands a commodity that metastasized imperial ambition. Tobacco funded settlements and fed merchant networks that underwrote further expansion. It exerted a strong gravitational pull. States sought revenue from its trade, planters sought profit in its cultivation. Workers were drawn or forced into labor systems that the demand for leaf made increasingly coercive. The same traits that made tobacco an excellent ritual vehicle, its portability, storability, and rapid, potent effect on the senses, made it a near-perfect commodity. Few things traveled so well or rewarded repeated use so reliably. There was bitter irony in that portability. A plant once cultivated as a vehicle for prayer was booked into cargo manifests and double-entry ledgers. A plant that once symbolized reciprocity became a standardized unit of value measured in weight and price. The transformation was fast and often brutal. Within 2 centuries of Columbus's first glimpse of tobacco smoke, the plant had circled the globe. It had been embraced by merchants and kings, taxed, praised, and condemned, and it had helped finance colonies that would reshape continents. If there is a dark cord running through this story, it is this: the commodification of tobacco-forged patterns that outlasted individuals and intentions. The plant's capacity to create habitual use, to be both craved and needed, bound itself to profit and coercion. The demands for more land, more labor, more leaves generated a momentum in which older social meanings were crowded out by exchange value. Sacred bundles became hogsheads, ritual smoke became standardized freight. Empires do not arise from design alone. They accumulate around habits that become markets, and markets that seek political protection and legal form. Tobacco was not the only commodity that performed this work, nor the first, but its chemistry and its broad sensory appeal made it uniquely effective in building an oceanic economy. The quiet labor of indigenous cultivators, the curiosity of early explorers, the physicians' pens that wrote tobacco into pharmacopoeias, the merchants' ledgers in port cities, and the plantation labor systems that pressed human hands into the soil, all of these strands braided together into an intricate, seemingly inexorable economy. Figures like John Rolfe and Jean Nicot appear as bright knots in this braid, convenient names for structural shifts. But the fuller truth lies in a longer weave. Seeds that indigenous communities had guarded and exchanged for generations were folded into new patterns. Ships transported them across oceans. Markets bent to accommodate them. Laws and taxes followed, and social orders reoriented around the production and exchange of this one plant. That rearrangement was slow but restless. The leaf that once carried a village's prayers to its ancestors became a commodity that made empires audible to one another through ledgers, tariffs, and treaties. The ritual knowledge that had taught people how to use tobacco was overwhelmed by mass demand. Markets and states coalesced to harvest not just leaf, but human labor and soil, until the cultivation of a single plant touched nearly every axis of early modern Atlantic life. politics, warfare, labor, law, and culture. A humble leaf had become a lever. As the 17th century unfolded, tobacco was no longer simply an American indigenous plant with many ceremonial roles. It had become an engine of transatlantic exchange, a standard for wages and taxes, and a commodity around which men fought over land, labor, and credit. The early tobacco economy set patterns that later crops, sugar, cotton, coffee, would amplify. Tobacco's first chapters show clearly how a plant can move from kitchen gardens to ocean cargo, helping to shape the political economy of an entire hemisphere. In its scent linger both ritual and market, the cedar tang of a pipe and the damp, heavy perfume of a hogshead. In that scent resides the uneasy memory of a transformation that built empires and scarred peoples whose histories began long before an Atlantic crossing. Tobacco reshaped the Chesapeake not by single decree, but as a slow, insinuating law that refashioned land, labor, and statutes to suit its appetite. In the first years after Jamestown's founding in 1607, mere survival absorbed the colonists' energy. Profit came second. But when John Rolfe planted the smoother, sweeter Nicotiana tabacum he had acquired from the Caribbean and managed to produce a marketable leaf by about 1612, the colony discovered its calling. Tobacco is a crop that favors rivers. It demands sun and warm earth, and the broad tidal inlets of the James, York, and Rappahannock answered with long ribbons of fertile shoreline perfect for the strip plantations that would define the Chesapeake landscape. Estates faced the water because the cheapest road was always the tide. Ships could be loaded with hogsheads at private wharves. A hogshead of tobacco, approaching 1,000 pounds of compressed leaf, became a portable unit of value and a stand-in for coin in a colony starved of specie. The Virginia Company formalized the incentives that made such plantations flourish when it adopted the headright system in 1618, offering roughly 50 acres to any settler or sponsor who paid an immigrant's passage. The mechanism was elegant in concept and brutal in effect. Wealthy men who could finance dozens of passages amassed enormous tracts, stitching riverbanks with their estates. Their neighbors were often the same indentured laborers whose transport they had funded. The headright system encouraged a geography of scattered dominance, manor houses spaced far enough apart to command plantations, with courts and parish churches located for the convenience of landholders rather than clustered towns. The House of Burgesses, which convened in 1619, provided the political framework that allowed these men to turn land into power. County courts, staffed by the same planter class, handled everything from disputes to road orders. Public rolls became private assets. Credit and commerce followed the leaf. Long before formal banks existed in the colony, there were factors, merchant agents in London, and local tobacco middlemen who extended goods on credit against future crops, shipped hogsheads across the ocean, and kept exact ledgers. When prices collapsed, those ledgers could be lethal. A single bad year could cost a planter his land, shred his credit, and force him to sell enslaved people or servants. Tobacco imposed its own calendar. Seeds were sown and seedlings transplanted in spring. Fields were hoed and topped in summer. Leaves were primed and cut in the fall. Whole households organized time around the crop. The Tidewater's social life bent to that rhythm. There were court days and parish fairs, but also stripping days, inspection days, and the rituals of filling hogsheads and rolling them to the wharf. The smell of curing in green barns, the sticky heat of outdoor summers, the pale dust of dried tobacco on clothes. These became the textures of ordinary existence. The headright system, paired with the colony's constant hunger for labor and the European desire for Virginia leaf, produced a planter aristocracy. Men like Robert King Carter, 1663–1732, and William Byrd II, 1674–1744, were not just wealthy, they were architects of a social order. Carter accumulated thousands of acres, controlled hundreds of workers, sat on the council and in the House of Burgesses, and lent money at interest. Byrd's surviving diaries and correspondence show how plantation culture generated tastes, house designs, elaborate manners, and a passion for English books and portraits, an imitation of Old World refinement resting on New World toil. These families intermarried, consolidated estates, and passed down a language of status that created the so-called first families of Virginia. Their great houses, like those at Corotaman or Westover, functioned both as stage and storehouse, grand staircases and silver inside, piles of tobacco on wharf planks outside, and counting rooms where ledgers were balanced against the loading of longboats. Hierarchy was not absolute, especially at first. The initial labor pool in the Chesapeake consisted largely of indentured servants, not enslaved Africans. English, Irish, and Welsh workers bound themselves for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage, food, and clothing. If they survived those harsh years, many hoped to join the ranks of small freeholders. But tobacco's appetite undercut that hope. Its soil demands and market cycles meant land was constantly in play, sold, claimed, or absorbed before the next generation could stake its place. Combined with periodic price crashes, the headright scheme and the credit system encouraged the concentration of property and dimmed the promise that servile labor would one day become independent yeomanry. Discontent among the landless and the half-free sometimes broke into politics and violence. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 being the most famous eruption and left planters determined to build a labor regime that would prevent alliances across race and class. Everyday life in the tobacco colonies was gendered in expected and unexpected ways. Under English common law, married women were legally covered by their husbands. They could not own property in their own right. Yet the brutal realities of death and absence, men dying young, men away at sea, men traveling to London to settle accounts, meant that widows and unmarried women often stepped in to run households and, sometimes, entire plantations. Margaret Brent of Maryland in the mid-17th century stands out as a striking case. A woman who took on legal authority to manage estates and even requested a vote in the assembly when there were no free male voters present. She disturbed local expectations, even as she demonstrated how much economic agency women could wield. For most women in tobacco country, however, work was relentless and largely domestic. Cooking, mending, nursing children, overseeing household servants, spinning wool and linen. But here was a quiet shift. When harvest came, women also supervised tobacco processing. They picked, sorted, and prepared leaves. They sometimes managed curing and directed the tying of tobacco into bundles and hogsheads. In tighter port towns, widows ran inns, taverns, and small shops. In rural districts, marriage functioned as an economic contract as much as a social one, linking kinship and land. Urban development in the Chesapeake never produced grand cathedral cities. It mirrored the colony itself, an affair of river mouths, wharves, and inspection warehouses. The Tobacco Inspection Act of 1730, a practical piece of regulation, did as much as any law to shape town life. It created inspection warehouses across the colony, enforced minimal quality standards for export leaf, and in doing so, produced focal points where farmers had to deliver hogsheads. Those structures became nuclei for towns. Petersburg, which by the mid-18th century had grown into a lively tobacco market, existed because brokers and shippers needed a place to examine, store, and insure product. Williamsburg became the capital in 1699 because elites wanted a seat of government removed from Jamestown's disease-ridden marshes. Richmond, founded only in the 1730s and incorporated in 1782, developed where the James River's falls provided an inland hub for tobacco commerce. Even so, the Chesapeake remained fundamentally a plantation society. Towns were punctuation marks rather than centers until later changes in agriculture and transportation. Roads, canals, then railways rewired the landscape. If tobacco knitted land, labor, and law into a tight symbiosis, that arrangement soon demanded more labor than European indenture alone could supply. The arrival of Africans at Point Comfort in 1619, aboard a privateer's prize that had intercepted a Portuguese slaver, has become a symbolic milestone, but its real significance unfolded over decades, not in a single moment. At first, some Africans in the colony were treated like indentured servants, gained their freedom, and even acquired land. Anthony Johnson of Northampton County is a mid-17th century example, a man of African origin who gained property and status. But law, practice, and racial thinking evolved. In 1640, the case of John Punch, an African servant, condemned to lifetime servitude, after running away with 2 Europeans whose terms were only extended, is often cited as an early signpost in the racialization of forced labor. In 1662, the Virginia Assembly made a crucial legal choice in adopting the principle of partus sequitur ventrem. A child's status would follow that of the mother. This guaranteed that children born to enslaved women would themselves be enslaved, regardless of the father's identity. In the early 18th century, the legal scaffolding hardened further. Virginia's comprehensive 1705 slave code gathered scattered statutes into a single act that defined enslaved people as property, stripped them of rights, and set harsh penalties to discourage resistance and escape. Planters' desires and imperial commerce fused to make the Atlantic slave trade central to the labor system tobacco required. English merchants, sometimes operating under monopolies like the Royal African Company after 1672, reoriented shipping and finance to move human cargo on a scale that dwarfed local operations. Tobacco's labor demands were simple arithmetic. The crop exhausted soil, expansion required new acreage. New acreage required more hands. More hands meant either constant importation or a captive reproducing population. By the mid-18th century in the Chesapeake, enslaved Africans and African Americans constituted a large share of the population, their numbers growing through both importation and natural increase. Across the Atlantic, between the mid-16th and mid-19th centuries, roughly 12 million people were transported from Africa to the Americas in the transatlantic trade. The British North American colonies received only a fraction of that number, but the same ships, insurers, ports in Liverpool, Bristol, and London, and the same webs of credit were as essential to Virginia's tobacco fortunes as its river wharves. The plantation, in law and in practice, was an apparatus of control. Slave codes spelled out what enslaved people could not do: testify against whites, carry weapons, travel without written passes. They authorized patrols local white men tasked with nighttime policing and searching for runaways. Violence was the constant drumbeat behind labor, whipping as discipline, sales that shattered families, the looming threat of public punishment. Coercion wasn't only spectacular, it was embedded in daily routines. Work quotas, ration allotments, precise regulations of rest all shaped every day in the fields and quarters. Planters learned to weigh the cost of enforcement against the profits of tobacco. They invested not only in land and livestock, but also in legal frameworks, courthouse ties, militia units, and parish churches that offered moral cover. Tobacco profits oiled that machinery. The more money leaf brought, the more resources planters could pour into securing and expanding their labor system. Resistance took many forms, both ordinary and extraordinary. Enslaved people slowed their pace, feigned illness, broke tools, maintained forbidden cultural practices, stole food, and forged family bonds through clandestine marriages and naming traditions. Others ran. Spanish Florida's policy in parts of the 18th century, which sometimes offered sanctuary to fugitives in exchange for military service, gave escape a map, however perilous. Maroon communities' hidden settlements in swamps and forests sprang up across the southern landscape. Large revolts underscored the system's fragility. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina shocked slaveholders and led to even harsher codes. In Virginia, conspiracies and uprisings, such as Gabriel Prosser's planned revolt in 1800 and Nat Turner's insurrection in 1831, testified that planter profits rested on a brittle foundation. Each episode of rebellion or rumored plot brought new restrictions: fewer pathways to manumission, more intense surveillance, harsher punishments. The economics of nicotine were inseparable from politics. To stabilize profit, planters sought to stabilize labor. Profit also drove territorial hunger. Tobacco's demand for fresh soil pulled settlers from the coastal tidewater into the Piedmont and then farther west. Colonists pushed into lands claimed by native polities, sparking fresh conflicts. Opechancano's 1622 attack, which killed hundreds and prompted relentless retaliation, was partially about land coveted by tobacco planters. Later wars and constant pressure broke native polities and opened more acres for the next planter with an axe and a crew. Soil exhaustion became a structural force. A piece of ground might yield rich harvests for a decade or two, then require long fallowing or heavy manuring. Many planters simply moved, claiming new head rights or buying out indebted neighbors. The Chesapeake's geography riverbanks, lined with plantations, treeless fields stretching inland, was not just scenic, it was the physical residue of repeated cycles of extraction and abandonment. If the story of settlement and social engineering is one chapter, the next is its replication. The economic and legal model of the tobacco plantation radiated south and west, shaping rice and indigo plantations in South Carolina and later tobacco districts in North Carolina and Kentucky. The leaf's role as quasi-currency, its discipline over labor, and its central place in maritime credit linked the Chesapeake to a global market and a global system of forced mobility. That global system encouraged innovations in production that would, over the next centuries, turn tobacco from a regional export into an industrial commodity. From Jamestown's first seeds to the humming factories of the late 19th century, the technological history of tobacco is one of small refinements and sudden jolts. Early Chesapeake planters learned the basics: sowing seed in protected beds, harrowing fields, transplanting seedlings, watching for pests. They mastered the art of cutting and priming leaves gradually down the stalk and curing them in barns, hanging them from poles to dry slowly. Curing itself was a craft. In the smoking houses and barns of the 17th and 18th centuries, tobacco was reduced to its core aroma, a sweet green vegetal tang that in damp weather could drift like incense along a river. Leaves dried unevenly, barn designs varied. Some growers used gentle fires, others heated flues that kept smoke out of the barn while warming the air. Those technical choices mattered. They produced distinct flavors and colors that buyers learned to recognize and reward. Regional specializations formed around these differences. Virginia and Maryland developed strains and curing techniques that produced fragrant, light leaf ideal for pipe smoking and snuff. Further west and south, other types, air-cured burleys in Kentucky and Tennessee, for example, became prized for their mildness when blended into cigarettes. In the 19th century, the development of bright leaf, or flue curing in parts of North Carolina, produced a fine yellow tobacco valued in the emerging cigarette trade. The origin story of bright leaf has a folkloric tinge tales of accidental overheated barns and experimental fireboxes, but its true impact was to create a mild, higher sugar leaf with a marketable golden color. This was not just flavor innovation, it paved the way for industrial-scale cigarette production. Processing also evolved, stripping leaves from stalks and sorting them into grades lugs, cutters, leaf, wrappers, required hands that could feel texture and see subtle variations in shade. In early factories and workshops, women and children often did the intricate work of stripping, grading, and tying bundles. Cigar rolling, once a tightly skilled trade centered in Cuba and later in immigrant neighborhoods in cities like New York and Tampa, demanded artisans who could assemble filler, binder, and wrapper into consistent cylinders. Those cigar rollers formed the backbone of a craft industry in the 19th century, skilled, sometimes unionized, and fiercely proud of their workmanship. The cigar's prestige, both as an object and as a social marker, relied on manual skill. But industry favors uniformity. By the late 19th century, the mechanization of cigarette manufacturing had upended artisanal dominance. The Bonsack machine, patented in the early 1880s by James A. Bonsack, changed production math. Where a hand roller might shape a few dozen cigarettes in an hour, the machine could churn out hundreds. It required more uniform leaf, a processing system capable of feeding a continuous assembly line, and capital to purchase and maintain the equipment. James Buchanan Duke and others recognized the opportunity. Mechanized production, plus aggressive advertising and organized distribution, meant potential market control. The American Tobacco Company centralized manufacturing and shipping, using Bonsack machines and predatory pricing to capture much of the US market until antitrust action began to break its grip in the early 20th century. Mechanization had human costs. Where cigar rolling had offered skilled jobs to immigrants, especially in cities like New York and Tampa, machines de-skilled much of the work and shifted labor into factories where women and children performed repetitive tasks under supervision for modest wages. Those wages sustained households but rarely granted independence. The gender map of tobacco labor shifted again. Women who had long been central to curing and sorting in rural barns now found paid work as wrappers, packers, and machine tenders. Men moved from brute fieldwork into roles as machine operators, supervisors, and managers. In wartime economies and boom periods, factories absorbed migrants from rural areas and from overseas, building dense urban neighborhoods where tobacco completed its final transformation from leaf to consumer product. The science of tobacco evolved alongside industrial machinery. Blending became a kind of chemistry. Manufacturers learned how to combine Virginia leaf with burley and oriental tobaccos to fine-tune nicotine levels, flavor, and burn rate. They used fermentation-controlled heating and microbial action to mellow leaf and bring out preferred tastes. Casing, the addition of sweeteners and flavorings during processing, became common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, allowing mass-produced cigarettes to taste consistent across time and geography. These were not trivial adjustments. They were systems engineering. Leaf selection, curing method, cut size, blend composition, paper, and eventually filters were all optimized together to create a product that could be manufactured, branded, and consumed in staggering quantities. From colonial barns to mechanized plants, tobacco production remained a logistics puzzle. Seeds required precise timing. Harvests demanded large crews for a few intense weeks. Barns required careful ventilation and fuel for fires. Warehouses needed inspection regimes and insurance. Ships needed packing standards and stowage plans to maximize space and minimize moisture damage. Every technological fix improved plows, better fertilizers, curing innovations, stripping tools, rolling machines, solved a bottleneck in the chain from seed to smoke. Each fix, in turn, reshaped who profited and who labored. Mechanization favored those with capital. Curing innovations favored regions whose soils and climates could be adapted. Blending and branding favored companies wealthy enough to buy national advertising and build distribution networks. If we walk backward from the mechanized factory and the branded pack to the first plantation clearings, a clear line appears. A plant with a taste for sun and a readiness to turn soil into saleable leaf reorganized societies around it. It created a landed elite, helped fashion legal regimes to secure labor, accelerated the Atlantic traffic in enslaved people, and nourished a set of technologies that, over centuries, standardized and multiplied consumption. The same crop that crowded Jamestown's wharves with hogsheads and turned riverbanks into long green corridors later became embedded in the folds of industrial capitalism and global advertising. The smell shifted from wet, curing leaves to the rich smoke of a cigar, to the dry, chemically tuned scent of a filtered cigarette. But the underlying architecture stayed familiar. A supply chain built on extraction, a market built on recurring demand, and a political economy that deployed law and force to keep everything moving. Within that steady continuity, we notice specifics: the ledger of a Virginia factor in London, a headright claim sketched on parchment, a rough river wharf plank, barns where leaves hung like mobiles, warehouses that seeded towns, statutes that declared people property, machines that spit out 1,000 cigarettes while a clerk clipped coupons, and an ad man wrote copy promising vigor and sophistication. Material changes brought human consequences. They rearranged who could access land, who could tap markets, and who could hope for autonomy. The bright leaf fields of North Carolina and the dim warehouses of Liverpool were both nodes in a network that rewarded scale and punished resistance. It is a story of ingenuity and calculation, of seeds and seamstresses, of law, ledger, and lash. There is a quiet irony at its core. A plant that colonists first grew as a means of surviving in an indifferent environment later helped make survival subordinate to profit. The same leaf that once circulated as money eventually became a branded product whose appeal helped produce a public health crisis early planters could never have foreseen. The technologies that made tobacco so portable and uniform also made it ubiquitous. Mechanization turned artisans into machine minders. Processing chemistry transformed rustic aromas into standardized flavors. Shipping networks turned a local crop into a global commodity. The planter who measured his wealth in hogsheads might have laughed if told that his heirs in industry would one day measure theirs in packs sold by the millions, each stamped with a warning label and a tax code. beneath the seemingly tranquil surfaces of barns and ledger books, lay the relentless mechanisms of expansion. Soil spent, forests cleared, markets opened, people bought and sold, laws drafted and redrafted to protect the chain. Tobacco did more than generate money. It helped create a social order that could be defended in courts, guarded by militias, and reproduced through marriage and inheritance. Technologies of production seedbeds, barns, curing schemes, rolling tables, automated cigarette lines were the means by which that order preserved itself and grew. They were technical answers to a political question: how to make labor reliable, predictable, and profitable at scale. Thus, the Chesapeake's early experiments with a single plant unfolded into an empire of techniques, markets, and rules. Men and women, in their many roles, turned seeds into a cash crop, and in doing so, built institutions that lasted far longer than any one of them intended. The rivers still flow. In some places, the old barns have become museums, in others, warehouses. The factories now often sit far from the original tobacco fields. Yet the imprint remains a plant that demanded much and returned only some, that reorganized geography, nurtured new legal systems, and birthed technologies that standardized pleasure and profit across centuries. It is a long, patient, and at times terrible history where horticulture and human governance meet to make a world that is, for better and worse, recognizable today. The plant that had been coaxed, harvested, and smoked along American rivers began to move outward like a slow but certain tide carried in sailors' pockets and cargo holds, in the diplomatic gifts of envoys, and in the bundled wares of merchants who knit the oceans together from Seville to Surat, from Lisbon to Nagasaki. By the mid-16th century, tobacco already labeled Nicotiana, thanks to a French ambassador who sent seeds to Catherine de' Medici in the 1560s and lent his name to its best-known alkaloid, was no longer merely a curiosity. It was becoming a commodity whose uses were as pliable as its leaves. The Portuguese, first among Europeans to plant durable footholds in West Africa and Asia, became the earliest wide scatterers of tobacco beyond Europe. Their seaborne trade slipped seeds into Goa and Macau. From there, the plant crept into new soils and new rituals. When Japanese hosts first met Portuguese sailors at Tanegashima in 1543, they also met tobacco. Within a century, the small metal kisaru pipe sat as naturally in the pockets of townspeople as the sword did at a samurai's hip. Europe's empires were not simply ferrying a plant from point A to point B. They were opening pathways along which entire social and economic systems could be rearranged. The Dutch East India Company, English and French chartered companies, Spanish mercantile networks, and later the imperial arteries of Britain all carried leaf, knowledge, and practice to regions where tobacco grafted itself onto existing customs. In West Africa, Portuguese and later Dutch traders introduced smoking and chewing. African merchants folded tobacco into their own social worlds. It was traded in coastal markets, used in ritual and oath-making, and blended into local mixtures tailored to taste and ceremony. In coastal Benin or Sierra Leone, a pinch of tobacco might be chewed alongside kola nut. Around Luanda, by the mid-17th century, tobacco had become both a common item of trade and a local pleasure. A small portable currency in transactions that stretched between Atlantic and African shores. Grimly, the leaf's fate became entwined with that of the humans moving through the same ports. Asia received tobacco on multiple routes and timetables. In India, it first arrived with Portuguese ships, but it was in Mughal courts and later in the bazaars of Delhi and the bustling towns of the Deccan that tobacco took on architectural form. The hookah, or hookah, a water pipe that pulled smoke through a bowl, and water emerged as a symbol of refinement in elite households, and as an engine of sociability in coffee houses and courtyards. The precise origins of the hookah are diffuse. Persianate artisans and Indian healers experimented with designs in the 16th and 17th centuries, but the device moved quickly through the Persian-speaking world, into Ottoman coffee rooms and into Istanbul's salons. There, the gentle bubbling of water in a nargile bowl and the sweet, spiced smell of tobacco came to mark leisurely conversation, business deals, and the exchange of political gossip. The Ottoman court, at once eager to appear modern and anxious about its subjects' habits, alternately embraced and prohibited tobacco. Sultan Murad IV in the 17th century famously banned both coffee and tobacco at different times, enforcing his edicts with theatrical severity. Yet such bans rarely lasted. In practice, the state preferred the stability of regulation and tax revenue over the purity of moral prohibition. China encountered tobacco through foreign ships and port city diplomacy. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, snuff-powdered tobacco mixed with perfumes had become a luxury among Qing elites. Snuff bottles carved from jade, agate, and glass were collected and exchanged like jewels, carrying artistry and rank as much as a pinch of leaf. Meanwhile, peasants and laborers in the countryside adopted smoking and chewing in diverse ways that reflected local plants and preferences. Sun-cured chewing tobacco in some districts, hand-rolled cigarettes in others, long or short-stemmed pipes in still others. In Japan, kiseru culture tied smoking to pilgrimage and the formalized pauses of tea houses. The Tokugawa shogunate eventually felt compelled to tax and regulate the habit, partly to finance itself and partly to keep order. Southeast Asia absorbed tobacco into pre-existing sensory worlds. In the Indonesian archipelago, tobacco met clove and formed an unlikely partnership. By the late 19th century, kretek clove-laced cigarettes had grown into a distinctive Indonesian industry, prized for their crackling burn and aromatic smoke. Under Dutch colonial rule in Java and Sumatra, tobacco cultivation and curing fed both export revenues and local cottage industries. The Dutch East India Company, and later the colonial state, tried to manage the crop as both an export and a domestically consumed taxable product. Across the Bay of Bengal and along the chains of islands and ports between British and Dutch spheres, tobacco joined the pan or betel quid, a green leaf wrapped around areca nut, lime, and often tobacco, staining chewers' mouths a deep red and becoming a ritual sign of welcome and agreement. There is a cruel intimacy in imagining the same plant rolled in Parisian salons and tucked into roadside betel stalls in South Asia, two habits that reveal networks of trade, taste, and unequal empire. It was in the Atlantic, where tobacco had first been domesticated, that the interweaving of leaf and coercion became most stark. In the Chesapeake, after John Rolfe introduced a sweeter West Indian strain around 1612, and colonists learned how to cure and market it to English buyers, tobacco functioned as money. Virginia and Maryland grew, cured, and shipped vast amounts of leaf to London. Colonial legislatures and the Crown watched those shipments carefully. Tobacco taxes were steady income, and in a mercantilist world, a dependable revenue stream could be as valuable as bullion. The product shaped labor systems. Indentured servitude gave way to a deeper reliance on enslaved labor as planters expanded acreage and sought to control costs. The triangular trade linking Africa, the Americas, and Europe fed the tobacco business. Ships that hauled enslaved people from African coasts filled their holds on the return voyage with hogsheads of tobacco or bales of cotton, then carried manufactured goods back to African markets. In Spain's empire and its Cuban territories, a different story unfolded. By the 18th and especially the 19th century, specific Cuban regions, most famously Vuelta Abajo in Pinar del Rio, gained reputations for exceptional leaf. That regional character underpinned a cigar industry whose clientele cared less about nicotine hit than about flavor and ritual. Cigars rolled by Cuban torcedores became cherished luxuries, shipped to Paris and New York. Cuban tobacco, cured in certain ways and shaped by artisans, became both a national symbol and an imperial prize. States from Madrid to London quickly learned that closely managed cultivation and state monopolies could yield stable revenue. In some places, tobacco proved too lucrative to leave fully to the market. The Ottoman government's late 19th century concession of its tobacco monopoly to a European syndicate, the Revol, did more than raise cash for a strapped empire. It effectively ceded a key revenue stream to foreign financiers, an emblem of how profitable commodities could become tools of both fiscal rescue and foreign influence. Merchants laced the globe with leaf and technique in ways that invited local reinvention. European factories in Bristol or Amsterdam handled hogsheads of American tobacco and exported processed products to colonial outposts, where local producers reworked them yet again. A pipe tobacco burned by a French sailor in Brest might be ground into snuff in Paris, chewed in an Angolan marketplace, twisted into a cigar in Havana, or fed into the stem of a kiseru in Edo. Commodifying taste opened new markets. Snuff boxes and ornate water pipes assumed the role of status items. Coffee houses in Istanbul and cafes in Paris became arenas where patterns of consumption and conversation intertwined, making tobacco an everyday social technology. Auction floors in London, warehouses in Amsterdam, and customs sheds in Alexandria and Cairo did what empires typically do, turned private pleasures into state revenue. Those ledgers shaped more than budgets. They organized social life. Tobacco carried meanings as layered as its cured leaves. In early modern European salons, snuff was aristocratic, a ritual of high manners, and an outward sign of global reach. To draw from a lacquered snuff box scented with ambergris was to demonstrate connection both to empire and to court fashion. The single pinch, inhaled with a practiced flick, came with its own etiquette. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, snuff culture blossomed into collections of boxes, spoons, and pouches as elaborate as table silver. Snuff boxes circulated as gifts among monarchs and ministers, becoming miniature ambassadors of taste. Pipes and cigars built different meanings in coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs in London, White's, Brooks's, and others. Smoking rooms became male spaces where politics, wages, news, speculation, business, and scandal circulated beneath a haze of smoke. The gentleman's cigar doubled as a political accessory as much as a matter of preference. To light a cigar in Parliament or in a club was to claim calm, wealth, and authority. By the 19th century, the image of the smoking gentleman spread through prints and portraits. Statesmen and industrialists held cigars like badges of office. Outside the clubs, in factory yards and at the docks, the pipe became emblematic of work and continuity. A shipwright or longshoreman with a corncob or clay pipe clamped between his teeth performed a recognizable social type. The pipe signaled steadiness, a habitual ritual that helped structure community life. Brief rests became smoke breaks. Sharing a pipe or a plug of chew helped knit bonds, and employers sometimes leaned on that rhythm as part of the workday. Literature and art soaked up these meanings and exhaled them for new audiences. The detective with his pipe, the poet leaning in a smoky cafe doorway, the flaneur with a languid cigarette tobacco became visual shorthand for reflection, modernity, vice, and sometimes liberation. Painters and poets used thin ribbons of smoke as compositional devices or symbols of boredom, desire, or thought. Novelists put cigarettes into the hands of characters who were modern and unmoored, sometimes decadent, sometimes brave, always vividly human. Gender and class tangled themselves into these habits. For centuries in Europe, smoking was coded masculine. Women might take snuff at court, but public smoking by women was widely taboo. Elsewhere, the lines were different. In some indigenous American societies, women smoked in ritual settings. In parts of Africa and Asia, women had long chewed tobacco or used it in betel preparations. Well before Victorian norms tried to script public behavior. The loudest rupture came in the 20th century, propelled not by gentle cultural drift, but by a powerful machine of persuasion and profit. World War I taught millions to smoke. Armies handed out cigarettes as part of daily rations. Lighting up beside someone in a trench or dugout became a basic gesture of comfort and solidarity. Veterans brought those habits home. Advertising agencies and brand strategists saw their moment. Factories now had the capacity to produce cigarettes by the billions. The public could be cultivated. A famous episode in public relations illustrates this with almost stage-like clarity. In 1929, Edward Bernays orchestrated a publicity stunt in New York in which women lit cigarettes during the Easter parade, framed as torches of freedom. It was part socio-political theater, part sales campaign. By tying smoking to the language of emancipation and suffrage, Bernays helped pry open a taboo in service of a brand. The move was cynical and effective. Women's smoking rates climbed through the interwar years, accelerated by wartime labor and expanded freedoms. and were pushed still higher by campaigns that cast cigarettes as sleek modern accessories for the newly liberated woman. If consumption shaped identity, the cigarette did so with unusual force. It could be marketed as chic and forward-looking, or as a working person's cheap comfort, as the aristocrat's slow cigar or the bohemian's ragged cigarette behind the ear. From Paris to Buenos Aires, cigarettes were braided into the lifestyle of artists and intellectuals. The stubbed-out butt on a cafe table became punctuation in a new kind of sentence. Advertising, endlessly inventive, amplified cultural cues. Fashion models, movie stars, athletes, even doctors appeared in campaigns, lending their desirability or credibility to brands. Some artists and writers used tobacco ironically as a prop. Others used it to critique a society entranced by consumption. As the 20th century advanced, production itself consolidated. The mechanization of cigarette making formed a crucial axis in the story. James Albert Bonsack patented an automatic cigarette machine around 1880 that could roll and cut cigarettes at a rate no human worker could match. James B. Duke in the United States saw the future in that machine. By coupling mechanized production with aggressive distribution, discounts, and control over retail space, Duke and W. Duke, Sons and Cobas, and later the American Tobacco Company he helped form in 1890, expanded the market, and with it the social reach of cigarettes. Economies of scale allowed brands to invest heavily in what had previously been luxuries. Sophisticated packaging, national advertising, sponsorships. The American Tobacco Company grew into a colossus, prompting an antitrust backlash. In 1911, the US Supreme Court ordered its breakup into separate firms, a lesson in how innovation-driven industrial concentration could invite legal correction. Across the Atlantic, British manufacturers and imperial interests reorganized to withstand American competition. Imperial Tobacco, formed in 1901, brought several British firms under one roof. British American Tobacco, BAT, founded in 1902, managed overseas distribution, claimed colonial markets, and secured leaf supplies. These companies did more than sell cigarettes. They built global brands and supply chains, negotiated with planters and colonial officials, and invested in production in Cuba, Java, the American South, and West Africa. They became skilled at playing governments against one another to ensure cheap raw materials. Labor regimes adapted to this demand. In many regions, cheap leaf depended on systems of peasant dependency, contract farming, and exploitative tenancy. In others, the obsession with particular leaf types, sun-cured, flue-cured, air-cured, Virginia, burley-shaped entire agricultural zones. Branding language evolved from simple logos to full-blown mythologies. Pack designs became compressed identities, the red and white bars of a pack, the cowboy silhouette under an orange sky, the promise of mildness or filters set in confident type. These visual cues constructed not just preference, but aspiration. Cigarettes demanded not only shipping, but persuasion. Madison Avenue agencies learned to mine psychology, using celebrity endorsements and sponsorships like currency. Radio, then television, offered advertisers new ways to capture ears and eyes. In the early 20th century, cigarette brands financed radio serials and film premieres and stamped themselves into sports uniforms and race cars. From Bernays' Torches of Freedom to the Marlboro Man debuting in 1955, campaigns tried to turn desire into daily habit. That was the core industrial logic. Create a product that could be cheaply mass-produced. Create an identity around it. Turn that identity into a reason for people to buy, again and again. At times, companies leaned explicitly on the authority of science and medicine. In the first half of the century, some ads featured doctors and dentists offering endorsements, a curious alignment of commerce and credibility. As epidemiology in the 1950s, most famously the British studies by Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill, linked tobacco use to lung cancer, the industry shifted rather than surrendered. Filter tips were introduced and marketed as safety innovations. Light and low-tar descriptors appeared on packs and in ads as soft reassurances. Marketing wrapped itself around engineering. Filters, blends, and curing tweaks could be promoted as progress, even as the techniques of persuasion only grew more sophisticated. As the century wore on, targeting became increasingly precise. Focus groups, market research, and demographic segmentation let companies tailor brands to specific communities. Menthol cigarettes, for instance, were heavily promoted in African American neighborhoods. Youth-oriented imagery and styles aimed to catch each new cohort at its most impressionable. Sponsorships shifted from radio shows to stock car racing and Formula One, then to music festivals and cultural events. The reach became fully global. A British firm could coordinate campaigns in Latin America. A US firm could buy radio time in Cairo. The promise of modern lifestyle, relaxation, a small act of rebellion was not universally persuasive, but it could be exported, and multinational firms excelled at export. The industry engineered not only desire but habit. Blends were calibrated Virginia bright leaf mixed with burley and oriental tobaccos to create particular sensory profiles from aroma to throat hit. Filters were highlighted as improvements even when their benefits were marginal or offset by compensatory smoking behavior. In boardrooms and labs, engineers tinkered with draw resistance, paper porosity, and the precise cut of the blend. Cigarettes became finely engineered consumer goods, their features honed to maximize repeat purchase. Corporations built around this logic amassed great wealth, political clout, and eventually intense public scrutiny. Advertising acted as a magnifying glass through which culture viewed tobacco. It offered scripts for masculinity and femininity, cosmopolitan living, and everyday rituals, coffee breaks, after dinner smokes. It tidied and retouched desire when scientific evidence began to outline tobacco's costs, when epidemiology drew lines from daily inhalation to disease. The same industry that had created the market deployed new rhetoric: personal choice, pleasure, doubt about the science. It funded research, think tanks, and eventually highly polished responsibility campaigns that often served more as reputation management than as genuine contrition. By the end of the 20th century, tobacco companies were deeply woven into commercial life. Regulating them became both public health necessity and political contest. Outside corporate suites, ordinary smoking rituals remained. Hookahs in cafes still burbled over gossip. Snuff boxes persisted as heirlooms. Kretek smokers in Java inhaled on their own schedules. Workers still leaned over railings for a quick break. The plant spread had created not just markets, but durable rituals. Those rituals were the real capital that brands learned to monetize. For empires, tobacco had been a revenue stream. For merchants, it was a trade good. For governments, a fiscal lever and diplomatic tool. For people in their rooms and courtyards, it was often simply a comfort and an identity rolled together. And so the story folds inward. From seed to empire, from auction floor to cafe table, from the peddler's pack to the billboard at a stadium. Tobacco rewired both global networks and local habits. It became a commodity that financed wars and fortunes, a marker of class and gender, and an industry that mastered the modern arts of persuasion. Its leaves carried more than nicotine. They carried images, obligations, and the faint, persistent smell of empires disassembling themselves into people's lungs. As the 20th century moved into its final decades, the very companies that had taught the world to smoke found themselves challenged on every front. Public health campaigns, lawsuits, and shifting social norms began to redraw the map of advertising and sponsorship. Television and billboard bans closed off spaces that once seemed limitless. Marketing slipped into subtler channels: retail promotions, brand extensions, cultural sponsorships in countries where policy lagged. Companies adapted. They relearned that the business of tobacco was as much about reading a society's mood as it was about curing leaf. They studied gender, class, and new geographies of demand. As markets in North America, Western Europe, and parts of Oceania shrank under tax pressure and social stigma, South and Southeast Asia and parts of Africa emerged as growth frontiers. In the quiet interplay between governments and corporations, tobacco remained a case study in how a plant can be turned into an apparatus of empire, how ritual and revenue can be braided into habit, and how persuasion can itself be industrialized. From the beginning, the arc had been global. Seeds carried by strangers grew into habits, and those habits into industries that reshaped people and places. Empires learned to tax and monopolize. merchants learned to package and brand, workers learned to time their days by the light of mid-afternoon smoke breaks. Societies marked themselves with snuff boxes, kretek clouds, or cigarette packs, choosing whichever image felt, or was sold as most desirable in the moment. It is a long, slow-burning history woven into the smallest gestures of modern life. What began as an American leaf evolved, by craft and commerce, into an empire of consumption that the world can still feel faintly on its breath. The scent of cured leaf and the shine of brass on a hookah bowl, the red-stained cheek of a betel and tobacco chewer, the embossed lid of a snuff box, the small white rectangle pulled from a pocket. These are the artifacts left in the wake of tobacco's global journey. They speak of voyages and monopolies, clever machines and cleverer marketing, of courts and coffee houses, laws and loopholes. They remind us that global trade is not only the big ledger of fleets and tariffs, but also the intimate choreography of hands and mouths, of rituals learned, borrowed and repurposed. In that choreography, tobacco finds its most stubborn form of power, not as an empire of open conquest, but as an empire of habit, built leaf by leaf inside the everyday routines of the world. If there is an irony in this long arc, it is that the plant traveled so far and did far more than any early trader might have imagined. It became not only a commodity that financed imperial budgets, but also a language through which people expressed class, gender, and modern identity. Corporations learned to listen to that language and convert it into polished advertising, brand promises, and the careful engineering of preference. The rest of us learned, often without meaning to, how to turn a plant, reworked by industry, into a habit that meant much more than simple leaf and smoke. The history is both global and intensely personal. It still shapes how we inhale history every time we breathe in and out. When James Albert Bonsack lowered his first cigarette rolling machine from the workbench in Roanoke in the early 1880s, the noise it made was not just metal on metal. It was the first faint mechanical whisper of a new human economy. The machine did what hundreds of hands had done, but it did so without fatigue. It filled, wrapped, and cut, turning out a steady, unblinking procession of identical cigarettes, each small, compact, and ready for a branded box. Patent dates stand like polite mile markers, but the true change was logistical and social. A cigarette that could be reproduced mechanically at scale could be sold cheaply enough to become ordinary. In Durham, North Carolina, James B. Duke recognized the opportunity. He secured favorable access to Bonsack's machines, built distribution networks across rail lines and state borders, and married industrial speed to the old commodity of cured tobacco. By 1890, his American Tobacco Company had absorbed rivals, controlled shipping routes, and centralized production to such an extent that cigarettes no longer looked like crafts. They looked like outputs of an unstoppable assembly line. Compressing tobacco into a slim white tube recalibrated taste, habit, and industry. Cigars and pipes demanded time and ritual. Cigarettes were fingertip conveniences, smoked between train stops, between acts, between phone calls. Bonsack's machine and its successors cut labor costs and slashed unit prices. That math required volume. What had once been an occasional luxury became, for many, a constant companion. Because machines made cigarettes cheap, marketers could saturate the market with brands. Brand names evolved into fleets of pocket identities. Lucky Strike and Camel in the United States, Players in Britain, Gauloise in France. Packaging turned into theatre foil crackling, tight cardboard boxes, that first burst of smell when a pack was opened, the slightly bitter first drag that would become habitual for millions. The world wars became accelerators. In trenches, barracks, and on troop ships, tobacco was not just common, it was institutionalized. By the time American soldiers arrived in Europe in 1917, cigarettes were already built into supply chains. Charities like the YMCA, Red Cross, and Salvation Army poured cigarettes into soldiers' hands as though they were socks or soap standard comforts. Armies distributed them, rations included them. Along the Western Front, a cigarette could serve as currency, condolence, or daily ritual. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, men returned home with cigarettes folded into their muscle memory. A habit learned in mud and fear followed them into peacetime factories, offices, and diners. World War II repeated the pattern. with cigarettes again issued in rations to Allied troops and brand loyalty reinforced by wartime giveaways and ads featuring brave men with smokes on their lips. The logistics behind this were immense. Factories ran in multiple shifts. Cigarettes were packed, palletized, and rushed by rail and ship across continents and oceans. Wherever those cigarettes went, they left new consumers behind. Machines and wars together erected an infrastructure of dependence. Cities carved out industrial districts for cigarette plants. Farmers in Kentucky and Virginia, in Sumatra and Java and the Philippines, tended fields key to export calendars. Governments collected excise taxes, thick, predictable, and politically appealing. Corner shops learned which brands sold fastest. Railroads timed deliveries around promotional pushes. Everything operated at a relentless industrial scale. What had once been a small craftsman's trade in a provincial cafe had, by mid-century, become a global pocket habit. Filtration and product design followed the logic of this scale. Filters were widely adopted in the 1950s, presented as technological shields against mounting health concerns. Light and low-tar categories appeared, buoyed by machine-tested yields that looked better on paper than they performed in actual lungs. These tweaks mattered. A cigarette engineered to deliver nicotine efficiently made a customer harder to lose. A filter perforated with ventilation holes could fool testing machines into reading lower tar levels, even as human smokers unconsciously drew more deeply or covered the holes. Engineers had their metrics, marketers had their slogans, smokers had their habits. The habits were not evenly distributed. Tobacco companies, eager to profit from social change, steered campaigns toward new reservoirs of customers. In the 1920s, Edward Bernays, the same public relations consultant behind the Torches of Freedom stunt and nephew of Sigmund Freud, was hired by Lucky Strike to help break the taboo on women smoking in public. The 1929 Easter Parade, where women lit cigarettes as a declaration of independence, was carefully choreographed to look spontaneous and emancipatory. It worked. A cigarette could now be cast as modernity itself, a symbol of independence, a small, defiantly glamorous gesture fit for magazine covers. Hollywood supplied glamour for free. Actors and actresses smoked on screen as part of character. Directors framed cigarettes like punctuation in a scene. Studios took advertising money or cooperated through more subtle product placement. By the 1930s and through the post-war era, smoking had been normalized in public life far beyond questions of taste. It became a prop, an accessory, a guard against awkward silences. The money flowed at every stage. The cigarette industry's reach extended into agriculture, manufacturing, transport, retail, and the state itself. Excise taxes became a dependable revenue stream. Governments that came to rely on tobacco income found it politically uncomfortable to treat the product solely as a threat. In many places, a quiet accommodation grew up between state and industry. Mild regulation in exchange for steady revenue. In Britain and its empire, Imperial Tobacco and its affiliates replicated the American formula: mass production, backed by branding, injected into every corner of daily life. In Southeast Asia and Latin America, the same machines cranked out cigarettes for export or domestic markets, often in flavors and blends tuned to local preferences. Tobacco's geography became fully global. Its logistics rivaled those of coal or automobiles. No single invention captured that industrial logic better than the cigarette rolling machine. Then, in the mid-20th century, the calm of broad acceptance collided with blunt data. Lung cancer rates rose in ways doctors had not seen before. Chronic bronchitis and emphysema appeared with frightening regularity. The pattern became too distinct to ignore. The earliest major warnings came from epidemiologists rather than laboratory scientists. In 1950, two independent research teams, one led by Doll and Hill in Britain, another by Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham in the United States, published studies linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer with striking statistical strength. In 1962, the Royal College of Physicians in London issued a report declaring smoking a cause of lung cancer and a major factor in respiratory and cardiovascular disease. Evidence piled up: case control and cohort studies, mortality data, clinical observations. What had looked like coincidence hardened into causation. In 1964, Americans heard the first formal nationwide reckoning. U.S. Surgeon General Luther Terry released a landmark report declaring cigarette smoking a health hazard of sufficient importance in the United States to warrant appropriate remedial action. The language was cautious but clear. Smoking had been identified as a major, preventable cause of illness and death. What followed was both scientific and political. Scientists refined methods, tracked large cohorts, quantified risks, and probed mechanisms. Laboratories isolated carcinogens in tar. Pathologists catalogued tumor patterns. Cardiologists tied smoking to atherosclerosis and heart attacks. The list of harms expanded: lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, pregnancy complications, and a long catalogue of other conditions. On the other side stood the tobacco industry, whose survival depended on selling a product now tied to widespread disease. Its response has become a classic case study in corporate strategy. In 1954, major U.S. companies pooled funds to create the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, later the Council for Tobacco Research, and later established a public relations arm, the Tobacco Institute, in 1958. That same year, they ran a full-page newspaper ad titled "A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers," promising research and reassurance even as they designed programs explicitly aimed at sowing doubt about the new epidemiological findings. Doubt, as a strategy, was cheap and powerful. The industry funded research not necessarily to produce competing truths, but to delay consensus and complicate the narrative. It insisted on definitive mechanistic proof before accepting causal links. It elevated contrarian scientists, stressed methodological uncertainties, placed sympathetic experts on panels, and spun off front groups to oppose regulation in the name of sound science and individual freedom. It launched youth smoking prevention programs that often served more as public relations shields than serious interventions. Internal documents, eventually dragged into public view through litigation and whistleblowers, revealed a striking disparity between public statements and private knowledge. Corporate memos ask how to maintain consumption in the face of damning evidence, how to ensure replacement smokers, how to fine-tune products to deliver nicotine efficiently and sustain dependence. These documents, once secret, now preserved in digital archives, show that tobacco chemists understood nicotine pharmacology, measured smoke yields, studied inhalation patterns, and developed techniques like ammoniation to increase the proportion of free-base nicotine and speed absorption. Engineers added filter ventilation to game machine tests, fully aware that human smokers would compensate. Mild and light brands were marketed on the basis of lab readings the companies knew were misleading. These tactics were not abstract. They appear in in-house reports and meeting minutes later used by prosecutors, journalists, and public health researchers to demonstrate that the industry was not merely slow to admit harm. It actively worked to preserve and even enhance its product's addictiveness. The release of those documents did not happen overnight. It unfolded through a long legal campaign. Whistleblowers and depositions offered glimpses behind the curtain. The most famous of these disclosures likely came from Jeffrey Wigand, a former research executive at Brown & Williamson, whose mid-1990s testimony exposed deliberate product manipulation and youth targeting. His story, dramatized in the film The Insider, 1999, captured public attention, but the true impact lay in the piles of documents unearthed through state lawsuits in the 1990s. When American states sued major manufacturers to recover Medicaid costs for smoking-related disease, courts compelled companies to turn over millions of pages of internal papers. Much of this material, memos, marketing plans, chemists' reports, board minutes, now resides in open archives, like the collection maintained by the University of California, San Francisco. For historians, epidemiologists, and policymakers, this trove provided a level of detail previously unimaginable. The political consequences were wide-reaching. Public health campaigns that had been gathering momentum for decades acquired new leverage and credibility. Governments moved beyond simple warning labels to more aggressive regulation. In the United States, Congress had already taken early steps. The 1965 Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act mandated rotating health warnings on packs. The 1970 Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act banned cigarette ads on television and radio beginning in 1971. But the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement between major U.S. tobacco firms and the attorneys general of 46 states shifted the landscape again. That settlement committed companies to large annual payments and sweeping restrictions on advertising and sponsorship. The headline dollar figure on the order of $200 billion over 25 years was not just damages. It was a tacit acknowledgement that states had been paying medical bills while companies profited. The agreement also yielded two major public benefits. It prohibited certain youth-targeted marketing tools, like cartoon mascots and most billboards, and it forced large-scale disclosure of internal industry documents. On the international stage, public health efforts coalesced into a formal treaty. The World Health Organization convened member states to negotiate what became, in 2003, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, FCTC, the first global health treaty of its kind, entering into force in 2005. Parties to the FCTC commit to policies high excise taxes, advertising and promotion bans, large health warnings, smoke-free laws that, implemented together, can significantly reduce tobacco use. Some countries moved faster and further than others. Ireland's 2004 nationwide smoke-free workplace law, including pubs, became a prominent early model, showing that strong policy could change behavior quickly when applied consistently. Australia later pioneered plain packaging, implemented in 2012, stripping branding from packs and replacing it with stark warnings and standardized colors. After surviving legal attacks from multinational firms, Australia's law set a precedent for aggressive regulation of brand imagery. Public health strategies blended law, economics, and persuasion. Tax hikes raised retail prices and cut consumption, especially among price-sensitive youth. Smoke-free laws altered daily routines by making smoking less convenient and less normalized. Advertising bans blocked many of the cues that once spurred impulse buying. Graphic warnings turned packages into small billboards displaying disease and risk. Litigation pried open corporate archives and extracted compensation. Mass media campaigns recast smoking from glamorous to deadly. The American Legacy Foundation's Truth campaign, funded by the Master Settlement Agreement, became a notable example. Using edgy, youth-focused messaging that highlighted industry deception, it helped drive sharp declines in teen smoking in the early 2000s. Courts added their own verdicts. In 2006, U.S. District Judge Gladys Kessler ruled that major cigarette manufacturers had violated federal racketeering laws by engaging in a long-running conspiracy to deceive the public about the dangers of smoking and adjudication, grounded in years of document review and testimony. Lawsuits around the world have produced billions in judgments and settlements, though appeals and legal maneuvering have sometimes blunted their immediate impact. Perhaps more consequential than any single case has been the slower cultural turn. Smokers who once casually lit up in cinemas, airplanes, restaurants, and offices found doors closing, first through law, then by custom. In many high-income countries, smoking prevalence dropped markedly. In the United States, adult smoking rates fell from mid-20th century highs to a fraction of that level by the early 21st century. In the United Kingdom, campaigns and policies spurred by early warnings from medical institutions and later supported by the National Health Service recoded smoking as a health hazard and a social nuisance. Workplaces went smoke-free. Airlines banned smoking on flights. Universities and hospitals posted big, clear no smoking signs at their entrances and in their grounds. Cigarettes steadily lost their cultural glamour and, in many settings, became stigmatized. But regulation and litigation did not end the story. They marked the beginning of a new phase. As the rich world's markets tightened, multinational companies pivoted aggressively toward lower and middle-income countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where rules were weaker and youth populations large. They deployed familiar tools-targeted marketing, flavor innovations, point-of-sale promotions, where governments had fewer resources to respond. China, with its giant state-owned monopoly, remained the world's largest tobacco market, a reminder that political economies could generate very different relationships with the same plant. At the same time, entirely new nicotine technologies emerged, electronic cigarettes, and heated tobacco products, pulling tobacco's technological and regulatory story into the 21st century and presenting fresh questions to health authorities who had thought the old fight was, if not over, at least contained. And yet the public health mobilization of the late 20th century accomplished something fundamental. It turned private corporate knowledge into public policy and public norm. Where cigarette marketing once seemed unstoppable, a blend of research, regulation, taxes, education, and litigation drove real declines in smoking in many countries and reframed it as a behavior to be regulated and often discouraged. Economically, governments that had depended heavily on tobacco tax revenues restructured their finances or reallocated settlement funds. Farmers and workers, once tethered to a single commodity, sometimes diversified. In other cases, they were left behind. Generations who had been heavy smokers began to die younger and in larger numbers than their non-smoking peers, and the resulting burden of disease became impossible for even cautious bureaucracies to ignore. There is a somber irony in this arc. The same instruments that made cigarettes ubiquitous, the machine, the brand, the distribution spreadsheet, also supplied the tools by which societies later tried to control and repair the damage. Machines that counted deliveries provided data for policy. Brands could be regulated, taxed, and stripped of glamour. Shipping channels that once delivered cigarettes to every kiosk could just as effectively carry warning labels, tax stamps, and enforcement orders. The historical ledger is complicated. It lists lives and revenues lost to disease and addiction, governments that profited and then sought restitution, companies that engineered dependence and then fought to obscure the evidence, activists and scientists who collected data and refused to look away. By the end of the 20th century, the plant that had built an empire of addiction had met the beginnings of a counter-empire of health, uneven, incomplete, sometimes compromised, but real. Laws passed, settlements extracted concessions, advertising was curtailed, norms shifted, the past could not be undone, lungs could not be restored, but the architecture of the future changed. In wealthier countries, the visual presence of cigarettes was softened. In boardrooms and courtrooms, the narratives of denial lay in the open. Elsewhere, in cities and markets, newly targeted by the industry, cigarettes still flourished, at least for a time, until public health advocates learned to follow the same maps and tactics the companies had used. History, as usual, remained messy. The machines kept running, multinational corporations pushed into new product categories. Nicotine, as a pharmacological fact, remained compelling to human brains. Public health's victory was not the elimination of the product, but the rebalancing of power policy, law, and public argument beginning to hold the industry to account in ways that quieter decades had not. It was an achievement born of patience, the accumulation of data, careful legal strategy, and persistent public education that reframed consumption as harm rather than simple choice. When the smoke-stained markets of the wealthy world began to cinch tight, like a carefully pulled knot, the big tobacco houses simply adjusted their sails to catch other winds. Lawsuits and settlements, indoor smoking bans through the 1990s and 2000s, and the adoption of the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in 2003, together marked a tectonic shift. In many rich countries, governments turned decisively against smoking. Advertising was throttled, packs were defaced with warnings, and public spaces became smoke-free. Inside corporate boardrooms, strategy turned brisk and unsentimental. Where Western governments raised walls-higher taxes, plain packaging, ad bans, restrictions on public smoking, companies saw open doors abroad. Cities with growing incomes, youthful populations, weak enforcement, and political systems that could be persuaded, influenced, or outpaced. The pivot showed up not in dramatic declarations, but in shipping manifests, new factories, and quietly redrawn profit projections. Market maps drawn after 2000 read like a tour of the predictable. Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. Some of these places were long-standing tobacco heartlands. China, with its massive state-run monopoly, had long treated smoking as a domestic normality. But many others were newly attractive. Post-Soviet Russia offered millions of consumers with cash and few constraints. Eastern Europe had entrenched smoking cultures and emerging consumer economies. Indonesia combined cultural attachment to kretek cigarettes with a government that refused to ratify the FCTC. African countries had youthful populations and rapid urbanization. Parts of Latin America had patchy advertising rules and vulnerable institutions. The business logic was blunt. When growth stalls in regulated markets, you seek expansion where rules are thin and populations large. The methods were familiar. Companies exported the same playbook they had honed over decades and adapted it to smaller budgets and weaker regulatory environments. They registered distributors, opened or acquired local manufacturing plants to lower per-unit costs and tailor blends to local tastes, segmented prices so even the poorest consumers could buy the product, and launched packaging and flavor variants targeting women and adolescents. They sponsored festivals, sports events, and cultural venues where billboard ads were banned. They leaned on point-of-sale marketing in small kiosks and street stalls, where packs and single sticks could be displayed at eye level, often right beside candy. Point of sale became crucial, as did human distribution networks. A sales rep in Accra who could convince hundreds of kiosk owners to stock a particular brand. A cluster of curing barns in Malawi, built with company financing. A pop star in Manila with a cigarette logo slipped onto a concert poster. A cricket team in India with discreet tobacco branding on a jersey sleeve. In some regions, corporate philanthropy donations to schools, clinics, local charities helped buy goodwill and access to officials. This was more than advertising. It was the construction of an industrial ecosystem. On the supply side, many low- and middle-income countries remained dependent on smallholder tobacco cultivation. Leaf was bought through auction floors or contract farming systems. Companies, or their leaf-buying intermediaries, narrowed the field of buyers until a few firms set prices and terms. They provided seeds, fertilizers, and loans, tying farmers to tobacco season after season. This pattern has kept whole regions of Malawi, Zimbabwe, southern Brazil, and parts of India locked into the crop. In Malawi, tobacco long accounted for a large share of export earnings. When world prices fell, the entire national economy felt it. When they rose, poor farmers had powerful reasons to plant more, even when the long-term balance sheet health, soil, alternative opportunities did not favor tobacco. Leaf buyers streamlined logistics. They built curing sheds, financed barns, dispatched graders to rural buying points, and smoothed export channels so that a stack of green leaves cut in a remote village could, within months, be a branded product in an urban stall on another continent. The human arithmetic was cold but effective. Families who needed quick cash often put children to work in the fields and curing barns. Those children, handling wet leaves for hours in heat, were exposed to green tobacco sickness, nicotine poisoning absorbed through the skin, leading to nausea, dizziness, and weakness. Landscapes changed. Forests were felled for curing fuel. Soils were depleted after years of monocropping. Rivers and groundwater absorbed pesticides and fertilizers. Tobacco economies also exploited existing vulnerability. Credits and advances were offered against future harvests. If weather or pests ruined the crop, debts deepened, but companies at the top of the chain rarely bore the risk. Harvest season was when promises and obligations came due, enforced less by court orders than by access to the next seed packet or loan. On the demand side, once classic advertising that had been outlawed in wealthier countries reappeared in looser markets. Huge roadside billboards in Nairobi, bright displays in Jakarta shopping malls, sponsorship banners at concerts in Sao Paulo. Brand imagery returned, slim cigarettes for women framed as modern and elegant. Packs positioned as symbols of urban cool or upward mobility. Youth smoking prevention slogans showed up on posters produced by the very companies courting young customers. In much of Africa and Asia, per-stick prices were deliberately kept low, often only a small fraction of a day's wage-making daily consumption, affordable even for the poor. Unsurprisingly, smoking rates, especially among young men, rose through the 1990s and 2000s in many of these countries. While Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and Australia saw downward trends, global health watchdogs warned of a clear shift. The tobacco epidemic was moving south and east, following the same currents of globalization that carried electronics, fast food, and synthetic fabrics. The toll was not just counted in mortality decades later, it showed up immediately, in household budgets strained by daily cigarette purchases, in money spent on tobacco instead of food, school fees, or medicine, in workers whose health declined in their 40s and 50s, in women and children exposed to secondhand smoke in cramped homes, in the opportunity costs of land and labor tied up in leaf instead of food or diverse crops. Governance gaps worsened the problem. Many low- and middle-income countries had health ministries that understood the stakes but lacked enforcement capacity. Laws existed on paper but not on the street. Elsewhere, the industry cultivated ties with powerful politicians and business leaders. When tougher rules emerged, companies sometimes turned to international trade and investment law, arguing that regulations violated trade agreements or intellectual property rights. The lawsuits that Philip Morris filed against Uruguay and Australia in the 2010s over large warning labels and plain packaging were more than legal maneuvers. They were warnings to other governments. Uruguay, which required very large graphic warnings and limited each brand to a single presentation to thwart brand stretching, saw its measures challenged in international arbitration. In 2016, Uruguay won. The arbitrators upheld its right to regulate for public health, but the case was expensive and intimidating, especially for poorer nations. The message was clear. Strong tobacco control was possible, but politically and financially costly. As the epidemic spread into new regions, the World Health Organization and global health researchers projected that an increasing share of tobacco-related deaths would occur in poorer countries. This was not fate. It was the foreseeable product of corporate strategy and uneven regulation. Developing countries became stages where the industry could reintroduce old tricks. Colorful billboards, sports sponsorships, flavors, and youth-targeted imagery, often framed as symbols of modern life, even as they seeded future waves of disease. Meanwhile, scientists and policymakers were wrestling with a new problem: what to do about harm reduction in a world where millions were already dependent on nicotine. If long-standing tools like nicotine patches and gum helped some smokers quit but left many untouched, could new technologies provide less harmful ways to satisfy addiction? The concept of harm reduction was not new. Nicotine replacement therapies, NRTs, patches, gum, lozenges, sprays, in combination with behavioral counseling, had decades of evidence showing modest but real success in helping people quit. Prescription drugs like bupropion and later varenicline boosted quit rates further. Yet these interventions had limitations. Many smokers did not like or adhere to NRT. Costs and access were problems in low-resource settings, and these medical tools did not fully replicate the sensory and social experience of smoking: the hand-to-mouth motion, the throat hit, the visible cloud, the break itself. Into this gap stepped new nicotine delivery technologies. In 2003, a Chinese pharmacist named Hon Lik, whose father had died from lung cancer, developed a prototype for what would become the modern e-cigarette, a device that vaporized a nicotine-containing liquid into an aerosol for inhalation. Early models were unreliable and clunky, but the idea that nicotine could be delivered without burning tobacco was powerful. Through the late 2000s and into the 2010s, vaping devices evolved quickly. Refillable tank systems, customizable mods, and later sleek pod-based devices appeared. In 2015, a US company launched Juul, a high-nicotine salt pod system. Juul's design USB stick form, flavored pods, potent nicotine delivery transformed the market. It fit in a palm or pocket, produced minimal visible vapor, and used nicotine salts that made high doses smoother to inhale. Industry and some public health figures framed these products as a technological compromise. Keep nicotine, eliminate most of the toxic combustion products. Lab tests generally showed lower levels of certain carcinogens and toxicants in e-cigarette vapor compared with cigarette smoke. For some researchers and policymakers, this hinted at a pragmatic opportunity. If entrenched smokers fully switched from combustibles to lower-risk products, the overall harm could drop substantially. Yet evidence was partial, politics contentious, and ethics complex. A 2019 randomized trial led by Peter Hadjek and colleagues, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, found that, within a British stop-smoking service, e-cigarettes were more effective than traditional NRT in helping smokers achieve 1-year abstinence from cigarettes. But most successful quitters in the e-cigarette group continued to vape. For many clinicians, long-term vaping was preferable to continued smoking. For critics, it represented a new form of chronic dependence. Public Health England attracted attention when it publicly stated in 2015 that vaping was around 95% less harmful than smoking, a figure that later came under scrutiny for relying on limited evidence and expert opinion rather than long-term data. Still, the broader proposition that vaping was likely substantially less harmful than smoking gained traction in some circles. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization and others urged caution, emphasizing unknown long-term effects and the risk of renormalizing nicotine use. Then came a new challenge: youth uptake. In the United States, data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey showed rapid increases in e-cigarette use among high school students between 2017 and 2019. Devices like Juul, with youth-friendly flavors and slick designs, were heavily used by teens. Health officials called it an epidemic. At roughly the same time, in 2019, a spate of severe lung injuries and deaths appeared in North America, linked primarily to illicit THC vaping products adulterated with vitamin E acetate. The outbreak, labeled EVALI, e-cigarette or vaping-associated lung injury, created widespread alarm. Though the culprit was largely outside the regulated nicotine vape market, the public often elided the two. Another complication was dual use. Many adults who adopted e-cigarettes did not stop smoking entirely. They vaped where cigarettes were banned, but continued to smoke elsewhere. Dual users thus maintained much of the risk from combustible products while adding new exposures. Major tobacco companies also moved aggressively into the new market, acquiring or launching vaping brands and heated tobacco devices. Philip Morris International, long synonymous with Marlboro cigarettes, promoted IQOS, a heat-not-burn device that warms tobacco sticks to release nicotine-containing aerosol without full combustion. The company publicly declared a commitment to a smoke-free future, positioning its products as part of a harm reduction agenda. This corporate rebranding did not erase decades of deception and harm, but it complicated the policy conversation by inserting profit-driven companies into debates about public health strategy. The WHO FCTC includes Article 5.3, which urges governments to protect health policy from tobacco industry interference. That provision gained new urgency as manufacturers sought seats at the table in discussions about regulating alternative nicotine products. Snus moist oral tobacco, widely used in Sweden and Norway, added another layer to the harm reduction debate. Sweden's unusually low rate of male smoking and lung cancer has often been attributed in part to high snus use among men, suggesting that smokeless tobacco displaced cigarettes. Advocates cite Sweden as an example of substitution lowering risk. Critics note that snus is not risk-free. It is associated with oral health issues and possibly cardiovascular problems, and that its net benefit depends on whether it truly replaces smoking or simply adds a second habit. Policy arguments grew heated. Should regulators pragmatically allow or even encourage adult smokers to switch to less harmful nicotine systems? Or should they hew to a precautionary principle, restricting products that might create new generations of users or be exploited by the same companies responsible for earlier epidemics? Different countries answered in different ways. The United Kingdom leaned toward integrating vaping into cessation services with regulatory controls but relative openness. The United States oscillated tightening rules when youth vaping spiked, yet approving some products through the FDA's pre-market process. India in 2019 banned e-cigarette sales outright, citing concerns about youth use and regulatory capacity. For low- and middle-income countries already struggling with combustible tobacco, the question was particularly fraught. E-cigarettes might help some smokers quit, but weak oversight could lead to widespread youth uptake and industry capture of policy. Industry strategy was pragmatic: reframe themselves as nicotine companies, portray new products as solutions rather than problems, and argue for regulatory frameworks that favored their devices over traditional cigarettes while preserving profits. Public health advocates remained wary, pointing to the industry's long record of bad faith. Trust, once spent, is hard to restore. Science continued to evolve in real time. Systematic reviews and trials suggested a spectrum of risk. Vaping generally less harmful than smoking, but not risk-free. Heated tobacco, reducing some toxicants, but leaving others. Long-term effects still uncertain. Longitudinal studies among youth found that teens who vaped were more likely to later try cigarettes, though causal pathways remained contested. Governments experimented with flavor bans, indoor vaping restrictions, marketing rules, and varied tax structures. Alongside scientific and policy debates, there loomed a much larger legacy, centuries of harm already done. Tobacco's imprint is etched into mortality statistics, millions of premature deaths, waves of lung cancer, heart disease, strokes, and chronic lung conditions. It has left environmental damage, forests cleared for curing fires, soils degraded by monoculture, waterways contaminated by agrochemicals. Cigarette filters, marketed as a health feature, turned out to be environmental pollutants. Cellulose acetate butts now rank as the most common item collected in global beach cleanups. The economic and social footprint is heavy as well. In regions of the southeastern United States, in Malawi and Zimbabwe, in southern Brazil, in rural China, entire communities have long been structured around tobacco. Local banking, land tenure, curing barns, and knowledge systems all grew around this crop. When policies reduce smoking or companies change their sourcing, those communities can be left stranded. The comforting idea that farmers will simply switch to other cash crops often underestimates the obstacles. Entrenched credit systems tied to tobacco, soil-adapted and sometimes degraded by specific practices, lack of stable markets for alternatives, and the cultural weight of generations spent growing one plant. Programs to help farmers transition funded by governments, NGOs, and international agencies have shown mixed results. Where they provide guaranteed markets, technical help, and multi-year support, some have succeeded. Many more have struggled, especially when substitute crops cannot match tobacco's short-term cash flow or when support is too brief. This brings the story to a question of justice. The Master Settlement Agreement in the United States provided one model of partial corporate accountability, compelling manufacturers to pay states over decades and accept some marketing restrictions. Yet much of that money flowed into general state budgets rather than directly into cessation programs or community support. Elsewhere, fines, settlements, and excise hikes have captured only a fraction of ongoing profits. Comprehensive attempts to direct significant industry earnings toward remediation healthcare, farmer transition funds, environmental restoration remain limited and fragmented. So who pays for what tobacco has done? Governments that taxed and permitted it? Companies that designed, marketed, and defended it? International donors? The current answer is piecemeal, a patchwork of national taxes, occasional settlements, donor-funded health programs, and underfunded transition schemes. From an ethical standpoint, that is unfinished business. Looking forward, several futures are imaginable. In one, cigarette smoking continues its slow decline, nudged down by taxes, plain packaging, strong warnings, and the gradual cultural shift against smoke. Less harmful nicotine products capture a larger share of existing users, lowering overall disease without ending dependence. In another scenario, industry successfully recasts itself as a provider of clean nicotine, shifting entirely to vaping, oral pouches, and heated tobacco, preserving addiction and profit under a new banner. In a third, more ambitious endgame, governments pursue active denicotinization of cigarettes, sharp reductions in retail outlets, generational bans on sales to those born after a certain year, and strong support for cessation pushing combustible tobacco to the margins of legal commerce. New Zealand's recent experiment with a generational phase-out and drastically reduced nicotine content in cigarettes hinted at what such an endgame might look like, even as policy changes and political turnover complicated implementation. Other countries have floated similar ideas on paper. Any of these paths will need to address not only public health metrics, but also fairness, the livelihoods of those still growing and processing tobacco, the burden borne by low-income smokers and the environmental legacy left behind. They will have to include funding for alternative crops, economic diversification in tobacco regions, and cleanup of polluted soils and waterways. They will need careful regulation of new nicotine technologies so they serve adult cessation rather than youth initiation. Memory will matter too. A clear public history of tobacco, how it moved from indigenous ritual to imperial commodity, from field to global brand, from comfort to cause of mass death, is part of civic repair. Remembering guards against rewriting the story as though smoking faded naturally, instead of being engineered and then contested. Ultimately, the path toward a world less shaped by nicotine is not just technical, but moral. It asks what is owed to people whose labor and health built this industry. What responsibility falls on companies that profited, and what obligations governments bear, having both encouraged and then restricted tobacco over centuries. In the quiet moments after the debates and court rulings, the most powerful images of a different future are modest ones. Barns that no longer smell of curing leaf, fields planted in food or diversified crops, kiosks that sell water and phone credit instead of single cigarettes, children who help tend fruit trees instead of hanging heavy leaves in smoky sheds. It is not a neat ending, but it is a plausible one, and for all the long stories of markets and manipulation, it is the kind of slow human future that historians like to imagine, incremental, contested, and, if we choose it, real.